like to just very briefly introduce to you Dr. John the Webster. Introductions have been many over the last 2 days. I think most of the people in the audience have benefited and heard his lectures in the last couple of days and the feedback session. We're very grateful and very privileged to have him with us for these 3 days. Dr. Webster is the Professor of Systematic Theology at Aberdeen University, prior to which he held the Lady Margaret Chair in Divinity at Oxford University. But I don't want to dwell upon his credentials, because his credentials are deep and lengthy. Suffice to say that he is a man of God. He has a humble heart, and he has blessed us greatly in these last 2 evenings. And whilst I think many people have agreed with what he said, one or two have not. But I would like to just give him a word of comfort by reminding him of the words of Jonathan Swift, who said, "You may know the sign that a genius is in your presence, because all the fools in the world are in confederacy against him." And with that, I'd like to welcome you. I'd like to welcome you this evening. We look forward to hearing your talk. After the talk is finished, it'll last about 50 minutes. Then there'll be a time for some questions, following which a time of informal conversation afterwards. So with that, no more ado, and you've been doubly blessed with the voice of 2 Englishmen this evening. But thank you very much indeed, Dr. John Webster, for blessing us.
Thank you, Chris, I think. Okay. Good. Well, having devoted the first 2 of these lectures to thinking through God the Creator and that God's act of creation, in this final session I want us to turn to the objects of God's created love, that is, to the creatures who are made by God, the maker of heaven and earth. Once again, as we make our approach, a couple of preliminaries are in order. First of all, it seems to me important to register that as we move to consider God's creatures, we don't leave behind the doctrine of God. That is, we're not broaching an entirely new topic, one in which our thinking is guided by other authorities than that of God's self-witness, or one in which we can legitimately claim to rely upon our own rational competence in talking about ourselves. We're not entering, that is, upon some more secure ground at this point, because we've finally got round to talking about ourselves as those whom God makes. And that's because we can only talk of ourselves as creatures, and we can only talk of ourselves as creatures, as created being, when we speak about the ineffable majesty of the uncreated Creator. That means, therefore, that talk about God the Creator isn't, as it were, a mere preface. It's not something that we leave behind when we give our minds finally to talk about the creature. It's intrinsic to whatever we say about ourselves. It's a constant accompaniment, that is, to our consideration of the creature. That means, therefore, that the Christian authenticity of a theology of the creature is going to be seen in the persistence and the joy and the gratitude with which, in every passage of thought, we repeat the Christian confession that the Lord is our maker. Second, if we were to give a comprehensive account of the matter which we're pondering this evening, we will pretty soon discover that the material is virtually inexhaustible. We'd need to talk about the spiritual and material worlds, about the different orders of angels, humans and beasts with their natures and ends. We need to talk about the character of God's conserving and governing presence to creatures, and much else besides. And obviously, in the course of 50 minutes, or it's probably going to be 60 minutes, so be prepared, there's no way that we can cover that amount of material, so I've chosen to reflect instead on one particular topic within the theology of created being, which is that of the dignity of the human creature. This, of course, is only a fragment of what needs to be said in any comprehensive account of the creatures of God. But it is, I think, well suited to display some of the basic features of what theology has to say in this matter. It shows, I think, particularly well how in all our talk about creatures we have to keep referring back to the outer works of the Holy Trinity. It indicates how God's work as creator in the work of nature is inseparable from God's work as reconciler and perfecter in the work of grace. And it also, I'm going to try to shows us that particular kind of spontaneity within God's gift of life, which marks us out, human beings, as the kinds of beings that we are. And with that, let's try and proceed through discussion, beginning with section 1 there on the outline. The first and most fundamental point is simply that, in order to talk about the dignity of creatures, we need to talk about God. Only as such can we talk about creatures, and only as our talk is about creatures is our talk humane. That means, therefore, that a primary task for a theological account of human dignity is integrating the concept of dignity into an orderly presentation of the ways and works of God. A presentation which, of course, has to emerge from a deep sense of the intrinsic and unsurpassable worth of God in himself. Revelation 4, "Worthy art thou, O Lord our God, to receive glory and honour and power, for thou didst create all things, and by thy will they existed and were created." That is, what theology says about human dignity is governed by the Church's confession that its Lord and God is indeed worthy and has indeed created all things. Theology tries to indicate that creaturely life and history have being and duration and purpose by virtue of God's creative and preserving and glorifying work. He is the ground of creatures. Without him, all that we have is surface. And apart from him, any appeals that we may make to a notion of dignity are just cries of alarm or prohibitions or commands, but they lack the final authority to compel action unless they are grounded in God. Apart from God, that is, dignity is precarious. It's hovering in an order of obligation, but it's not tethered to the order of being. Obligation can only quicken us to act if it presents us with a true imperatival force, a force that derives from being itself. One of the functions, it seems to me, of Christian doctrine in moral theology is to try and inquire into how moral policy and moral action is rooted in the truth which the gospel announces. Dogmatics attempts to unfold the ways in which our dignity as creatures is attributed to us and is not finally contingent upon our social affirmation. That is, we encounter the dignity of other people, we don't just ascribe dignity to them, and we encounter it in such a way that that dignity is beyond our manipulation. That means, therefore, that creaturely dignity sets before us a requirement which is grounded in the purpose and will and work of God. Now, if we're to give an account of that, it seems to me we need to make two moves. First of all, our talk about human dignity needs to be relocated. Its proper setting is not, first of all, a pre-theological anthropology. No, its proper setting is the divine economy in which creatures enact who they are by participating in God's history with them. And it's that history which stretches from creation in the beginning through to its consummation at the end, and which has its central episode in the saving mission of the Son. It's that history which is the history of fellowship between the Lord and his creatures. And it's in that history of fellowship, that creatures come to have dignity and come to exercise the dignity which is proper to them. If that's true, therefore, then the second move is that in a theological account of human dignity, creatureliness is basic. Crucially, to speak of human beings as creatures is to indicate not only that they're contingent upon God, that they depend upon God, but also that they have a specific nature. Made by God, creaturely being is particular being. And creaturely dignity is therefore the particular dignity of those who are destined to be the children of God through Jesus Christ. Now, of course, to talk in those terms is counterintuitive in our culture. Accepting such claims is inhibited for us by a pervasive sense in our culture that human dignity is a self-evident, basic concept that we don't need to elucidate. It's one which we think of as simply available to us, simply something to which we can appeal confidently. And yet if we make that appeal apart from talk of God, we're in fact aligning ourselves with a complex of philosophical and political and legal traditions, and with the understandings of human nature that those traditions are bound up with. And those traditions are considered by our culture to be more comprehensive, more basic than the particular tradition of the Christian confession. Indeed, very often our culture thinks that what Christians have to say about human dignity can actually be folded back into some idea of natural religion or natural morality, because for our culture the natural precedes the confessional. And moreover, the traditions of our culture, as they talk about human dignity, are marked by a minimal deployment of language about God as we talk about human dignity. In talking about human dignity, that is, God is only pretty remotely operative, and God's characterised in ways which are derived from elsewhere than the Church's confession of the gospel. Now, how did that state of affairs come about? How did it come about that our talk about human dignity in our culture has got so disengaged from the belief structure of the Christian gospel? Well, of course, even the briefest sketch of that history can't be attempted in the space of one or a dozen lectures. But we can see how durable that tradition is and how distant it is from some basic affirmations of the gospel if we look at a very early episode in that development, which is the Aeration on the Dignity of Man from Pico della Mirandola. This was written in 1486. I put down 1496 there on the outline, but believe me, it's 1486. Well, it might be 1496, but anyway, it's somewhere between 1486 and 1496. Let's call it 1491. Okay. And the context of this quotation is Pico entertains the idea that God is addressing Adam. And he says, at last, the best of artisans, that's God, ordained that the creature to whom he'd been able to give nothing proper to himself should have joint possession of whatever had been peculiar to each of the different kinds of being. He therefore took man as a creature of indeterminate nature, and assigning him a place in the middle of the world, addressed him thus. This is what God says to Adam. Neither a fixed abode, nor a form that is thine alone, nor any function peculiar to thyself have we given thee, Adam, to the end that, according to thy longing and according to thy judgment, thou mayest have and possess what abode, what form, and what functions that thyself shalt desire. The nature of all other beings is limited and constrained within the bounds of laws prescribed by us. Thou, constrained by no limits, and in accordance with thine own free will, in whose hands we have placed thee, shalt ordain for thyself the limits of thy nature. We set thee at the world's centre, that thou mayest from thence more ably observe what is in the world. We have made thee neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with freedom of choice and with honour, as though the maker and moulder of thyself, thou mayest fashion thyself in whatever shape thou shalt prefer. Thou shalt have the power to degenerate into the lower forms of life, which are brutish. Thou shalt have the power out of thy soul's judgment to be reborn into the higher forms, which are divine. That's an extraordinary statement, isn't it? Notice, first of all, how radically Pico reconceives the God who addresses himself to Adam. He is the best of artisans. That is, he's not one who stands in a long-standing relation to Adam. He's basically a maker who takes pre-existent material and fashions it into a freestanding reality. And notice, more importantly, how formless is the figure whom this God produces, this figure of Adam. Adam's got nothing proper to himself, he says. He's got an indeterminate nature. What gives shape to his being is not the will of God, but Adam's longing and judgment. Adam is being without law. That is, he's got no order or shape or structure. Instead, what's basic is Adam's free will. He is, in the classic phrase, the maker and moulder of himself. And it's all that, Pico says, it's all that in which human dignity consists. To have dignity is to be the captain of yourself, to be one who directs, shapes, makes and governs oneself. It's an explication of dignity, in other words, in terms of self-culture, of making oneself. And yet, from the Gospel's perspective, that picture of human dignity can hardly be considered a contribution to human flourishing. Indeed, the opposite. It's a picture which serves to draw creatures from their well-being. What's required is a different account of the natures of God and God's creatures, and a different account of the goals of creatures. And it's these which the Gospel furnishes, and which I want to at least begin to indicate this evening. Section 2. For Christian faith, human dignity is the dignity proper to creatures. And creatures have their being within the specific situation and history for which they've been made by God, and which they discover and enact their lives. That is, dignity is a correlate of that special life-bestowing form with which we are blessed by our Maker and to whose performance we're summoned. That means, therefore, that what Christian theology says about human dignity is governed by a fundamental rule in theological teaching about human persons. Creaturely being is, and is available to be known and lived out, only within the grace of God's relation to us. Like our freedom, the dignity of creatures is not some property or power which is anterior to our history with God. It is something which emerges over the course of that history. And in that history, God is always antecedent. There's an epistemological corollary of that rule, which is that because there's no standpoint that we can adopt outside of our history with God, because we can't stop ourselves being creatures, the knowledge of our human dignity doesn't arise within the self-enclosed circle of self-reflection. It emerges in the course of God's life-giving presence. In the matter of human dignity, in other words, there's no original self-knowledge on our part. Creaturely self-knowledge is a creaturely act, and therefore to talk about it, we need to talk of God, the Creator. More practically, we're hidden from ourselves until God, the Creator, shows us who we are. Our dignity, therefore, is not transparent to us. It's not self-evident. It's something that we must be taught of God and learn from God. We're instructed, therefore, concerning our dignity by participating in the fellowship with God, which is our basic creaturely shape. And that means, therefore, that we come to learn about our dignity by virtue of what we call revelation. That is, revelation in the sense of God communicating himself and so instructing us not simply about himself, but about ourselves as his creatures. And that means, therefore, that the dignity of creatures is discerned in faith, that it's spoken of by talking the language of the confession, that it's celebrated in praise, because faith and confession and praise are acts in which creatures give shape to their part in the history of fellowship with God. In order to spell it out in a little bit more detail, I've got three propositions, the italicized statements on the outline sheet in section 2. The first of those is this. Human dignity has its basis in the loving act of God the Creator, who summons creatures into being and bestows life upon them, ordering their nature and determining their destiny by calling them to enact their being in fellowship with himself. Once again, to repeat, therefore, human dignity is the dignity of creatures. What does it mean to be a creature? Well, to be wholly originated, to owe one's being to the loving and purposive summons of God. That is, unlike the life of the Creator, the life of creatures doesn't come from itself and isn't held in itself. Creatures have being and life by virtue of the freedom and goodness of God, whose will it is, whose loving will it is, that there should be life other than his own perfect life. And because that's so, then the manner in which we have being and have life can only be explained by extensive description of the will and work of God. Creatureliness means absolute dependence upon that will and work across the entire span of creaturely being. So to be a creature isn't just to be a kind of self-standing product of an initial cause, as Pico's picture of God's relation to Adam is. No, it is to be and to live without restriction from beyond ourselves, out of the gift of life in God. Furthermore, therefore, to be a creature is to have a particular shape, that is, to exist as a particular configuration of reality. Formed by God, creatures have a given nature. Now, of course, we aren't to think of nature just as a kind of ineluctable fate. No, the nature that we're given is bestowal of life and a summons to live life in a particular direction or with a particular bearing. As we enact this nature, we are alive. That is, we're characterized by spontaneity and agency. And that's above all because in our natures as creatures, we are ordered to fellowship with God. It's of the nature of creatures, therefore, both to be given and to act out what we are, to be determined for life not only from and under God, but also for and with God. And so, therefore, there is a proper gift of life and also a proper creaturely spontaneity. That means, further, one more description, that to be a creature is to be appointed by God the Creator to a specific destiny, or if you want, a specific end. As we receive our being at the loving hands of God, and as we're formed to be a particular kind of being, so also we as creatures are pointed to a particular perfection. And that perfection is full happiness in fellowship with God. That means, therefore, creatures are not merely caused, they're not merely brought into being and left there. No, creatures are summoned by God to fulfill their nature over time, to realize themselves according to the form which has been bestowed upon them. And that's why to the creative work of God in bestowing being, there necessarily corresponds the preserving work of God, in which God upholds our being so that we can attain our end. Well, what are the implications of that very simple sketch of creatureliness for how we understand creaturely dignity? Well, first of all, back to basics, it means that the dignity of creatures is the dignity of creatures. That is, it's the worth or honour or glory of those who have their being in this summons of the Creator as it has enacted in our histories. Creatures have worth, and their worth is inalienable and inviolable because we exist in the gift of God. God is in himself perfectly realised. God is without want and therefore in need of nothing. But not so the creature. Creatures aren't complete in and of themselves. Creatures have needs in the deep sense that the being of the creature can only be had in relation to God. But notice, creaturely need and creaturely dignity are not in conflict. Indeed, they're inseparable, because need isn't deficiency. Need is simply the fact that the creature constantly refers back to God's original summons of life. And creaturely worth isn't imperiled by this reference back to God. On the contrary, dependence is of the essence of the kind of being which human creatures have. And so dependence is an ingredient within our glory, part of our dignity, an aspect of our worth. Barth says that it belongs to the true honour of the creature to need and receive the assistance of God. Now, once again, it's at that point that Christian theology is going to stand at some distance from a modern assertion that, for instance, in Kant's phrase, autonomy is the ground of the dignity of human nature. For Christian theology, on the other hand, human dignity is, if you want, alien. The term is, of course, drawn from discussions of imputed righteousness. But it can serve to indicate the way in which creatures actually have their worth. Alien doesn't mean unreal or alienated, any more than being a creature means not being alive. Alien simply means not from itself, not in and of itself, but only in the divine gift. And alien dignity is the dignity which is proper to us because need is basic and constitutive of who we are. This, however, doesn't compromise the stability of creaturely dignity. For Christian theology, the substance and continuity of creatures, and therefore the dignity of creatures, can't be had by us apart from the creature's summons. They are part of our history with God. The Spirit of God has made me, says Job, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. And it's only as we talk about that making, that giving, that work of God as Spirit, that we can begin to talk properly about human worth or human dignity. The obverse, second, of this claim, that creaturely dignity derives from God alone, is that in creating us, God dignifies us creatures by acknowledging and approving our life. God the Creator elevates creatures. God forms them not to be simple, mute, immovable objects placed on a chessboard that God himself will then bash around. No, God forms living subjects who are the object of his recognition. God chose to be God with creatures, and so honours creatures by electing them to be those with whom he wills to be. Remember again from Job 7, what is man, Job asks, that thou dost make so much of him, and that thou dost set thy mind upon him, dost visit him every morning and test him every moment? And that lament from Job is Job, as it were, trying to push God away, not want to be disturbed by God. It's a perverse repudiation of his dignity as God's creature. And that dignity consists precisely in the fact that God will not leave him alone, that God continues to encounter and affirm and honour him because God is the watcher of men. Calvin, in his commentary on Job, says this: we see how Job turns God's providence quite upside down, and instead of comforting and cheering himself with it, he would that God were far off. Why hast thou made me thy mark? Job asks. And the answer to Job's question, this is Barth's phrase, is this: God wants us for himself. That is, God crowns creatures with glory and honour. God marks them out as the recipient of his approval, and God sets them apart to fulfill their natures and to be happy by living in fellowship with himself. Creation, therefore, is exaltation. Creatures have dignity because they have been dignified by God. Third, this verdict of the Creator on what he's made, the Creator's judgment whereby creatures are declared to be the subject of his regard and to be honourable because of that, that verdict is God's alone. Only God the Creator can crown his creatures with glory and honour. Creatures therefore are not competent to ascribe dignity to themselves or to other creatures. Human judgments about dignity can only be repetitions or echoes of the divine judgment. They can only be acts in which we recognise honour as an indicative and an imperative which rests on a prior divine decision. The notion of the inalienable character of human dignity is so common, of course, in talk about human rights. The notion of the inalienable character of human dignity reaches towards this, though often I think it stops short of articulating the divine basis of the assertion and instead assimilating dignity back into some kind of anthropology. And yet it seems to me that it's precisely at this point that the basis of human dignity in God's decision has to be brought to the fore, because it's only that theological affirmation which has sufficient strength to resist the corrosion which happens when we make dignity something which we bestow upon ourselves or upon others. When that happens, then dignity becomes a function of the creature's will. But for the gospel, creaturely dignity is secure because it's not a function of our will. It is rooted in God's free favour alone. So in sum then, God the Creator bestows upon creatures their particular dignity, and whatever else may be said about human dignity, the basis on which it may be predicated is this: from him and through him and to him are all things, to him be glory forever. Proposition 2. God the Reconciler defeats creatures' trespass upon their own dignity, restoring them to fellowship with himself and re-establishing their destiny. When we move to this second block of material, when we begin to talk about God the Reconciler, then we reach the centre of a positive, dogmatic and moral theology of human dignity. Nowhere does it become more evident that what theology has to say about dignity must, by the nature of its object, have, as it were, an historical or dramatic idiom. Why? Well, because here theology is responsible towards that set of events in which God undertakes to restore the dignity of lost creatures. And so the adequacy of what theology has to say at this point is going to be especially measured by how it approaches and describes this centre of our talk about the dignity of creatures. The centre, of course, is not an isolated point. It's a position from which we look back to creation and in which we look forward to perfection. And yet reconciliation is necessarily the centre of gravity of the whole. Here, theology has posed to it the chief question about human dignity, which is the soteriological or eschatological question: how can creatures be restored to the dignity which they've abandoned? This is Augustine. The true honour of man is the image and likeness of God, which is not preserved except it be in relation to him by whom it is impressed. The less, therefore, that one loves what is one's own, the more one cleaves to God. But through the desire of making trial of his own power, man by his own bidding falls down to himself as to a sort of intermediate grade. And so, while he wishes to be as God is under no one, he is thrust on, even from his own middle grade, by way of punishment to that which is lowest, that is, to those things in which beasts delight. And thus, while his honour is the likeness of God, but his dishonour is the likeness of the beast. Man being in honour abideth not, he is compared to the beasts that are foolish, and is made like them. In other words, to figure out what we mean by human dignity for Augustine, we need to set our talk in teaching about sin and salvation. The true honour of creatures, that is our life in the divine image and likeness, is not so much an unchanging property of humankind. It's something which happens over the course of that history between God and God's creatures, a history in which our relation to God is repudiated by the creature and who thereby fall away from the dignity which is God's gift. Sin, in other words, is the rejection of the divine gift of life, a repudiation of the divine vocation to fellowship. It's a refusal of that absolute dependence in which alone creatures have life and by which alone they are exalted. The sinner doesn't consent to have being in the gift of God. The sinner refuses to enact the form of life which is the Creator's blessing. Sin, therefore, is disobedience. That is, it's a lack of assent to that which has been given to the creature as the shape of being, and so it's a contradiction of our creatureliness. In Augustine's terms, a descent to being bestial. And as such, it is a worthless attack both on God's honour and on the honour of creatures. As we withhold compliance to our being and destiny, then we actually erode our own dignity. Sin, in other words, is abasement. It abandons the righteous order in which the dignity of creatures exists, and thereby sin degrades us. It degrades creaturely life. When fellowship with God is compromised, so too is the dignity which accrues to creatures as they enact their being. And that sinful state which eventuates from that rejection of God can be characterized in a double way. It involves, first, alienation. That is, the objective breach of relations between creator and creatures, in which creatures come to discover that they have placed themselves at a mortal distance from the source of life and blessing. And second, it involves misery. That is, the subjective degradation which comes from our futile attempt to have life on conditions other than those established by the Creator's love. What does that mean? Well, it means that as sinners, we can do to ourselves what no other creature can do to us. We can take away our own dignity. Others may simply fail to recognize our dignity. Only we ourselves can sever fellowship with God, in which alone our dignity can flourish. No other person, only I myself, can repudiate my creaturely calling. This is because the creaturely side of my fellowship with God is in the end not constituted by others, but by my obedience to my vocation. And only I can abase myself by resisting or despising that vocation. Perhaps I do so because I don't care for my own dignity, but trample it in the rush to carnal fulfillment. Or, in a supreme irony, I may abase myself precisely by thinking that my dignity is constituted only as I make myself responsible for establishing and protecting that dignity. But both carnality and self-responsibility are opposition to God's gift of life. At the end of both, as Augustine tells us, is that creatures threaten to become at their own hands what they are not. That is, they become beasts. So I can abase myself. I can withhold my consent to the God-given form of life. And I can deny or devastate or erect a counterfeit of my creaturely dignity. But I can't abolish it. Sin, of course, is a potent threat to the destiny in which the dignity of creatures is enacted, but it can't entirely overthrow and bring to nothing the purpose of God. I can erode, perhaps even ruin the creaturely side of fellowship with God, but I can't unmake myself. I can't not be a creature made and called by God's love, even though I may have subjected my own being to a fearful onslaught as a sinner. For in the hands of God and his mercy, that very onslaught, that very rejection of myself, becomes the occasion for the unfolding of God's purpose to dignify fallen creatures through God's reconciling work. That is, God the reconciler defeats our trespass upon our own dignity. Once again, therefore, the setting for what theology has to say about human dignity is the saving renovation of creatures and their reintegration into the purpose of God. Now, how does God do this? What shape is taken by this divine protection of our dignity? The divine reconciling work is identical with a singular episode in the history of the human race, with the person and mission of God the Son. The dignity of creatures is restored because God is and acts as this one. The eternal Son takes our nature upon him. That is, he gathers to himself and bears the full weight of human abasement and misery and alienation. He humbles himself and in just that way exalts the creatures among whom he has set himself. We need to say more by way of description of that reconciling mission and its grounds in the eternal deity and honour of the Son. But before I do that, two clarifications. First, God's work of protecting the dignity of creatures has the form of a special creaturely history. It's special because its subject and agent is the eternal divine word. It's creaturely because the eternal divine word acts in union with flesh. Creaturely dignity, in other words, is not protected by promulgating a moral law. It's protected by a divine mission of reconciliation. And further, that divine mission of reconciliation isn't just an intrusion into human history. It's not wholly external. It is, in a crucial sense, the working time of a fellow creature. God restores our dignity not simply from outside, but from within. Now, of course, that from within rests upon from outside. Only in that way can the self-abasement of creatures be arrested and overthrown. And yet, there is a fittingness to the form which God's reconciling work takes. It takes the form suitable to the end of that work, which is the restoration of creatures to their vocation. And so the form of God's work, its shape as obedient human life in time, itself indicates that God loves us and so chooses to act in ways which will dignify, not debase creatures. And second, this special creaturely history by which God protects our dignity is the entire span of the history of the Incarnation. That is, our dignity is restored by the full scope of this divine mission. Its origin in the eternal procession of the Son from the Father, the assumption of flesh, the state of humiliation in which the Saviour takes upon himself the wretchedness of our human situation, the exaltation of Easter, the glorious rule of the Son as he's ascended and enthroned and as he presents himself to us in the Spirit's power. No one moment, in other words, can be isolated as in itself the ground of human dignity. Dignity is not restored simply by the assumption of flesh, not simply by the work of justification. Our dignity is restored by the whole thrust of God's reconciling being and work as the incarnate Word. And with those two qualifications, let's go back to describing how the Son acts to restore creaturely dignity. What happens? Well, God the Son takes flesh. That is, he freely appropriates the dishonourable state of sinful humankind. And he makes it his own, and in his own person, he suffers the breach of fellowship to which sinners have condemned themselves. And precisely in this way, he takes away the sinner's shame. He acts out our vocation as creatures, fulfills our destiny on our behalf, and so secures our dignity. This is a wholly divine work. That is, it's the work of the eternal Son, who even in the depths of his humiliation doesn't relinquish his antecedent divine glory. It's here that the concern of classical Reformed Christology, that the humiliation of Christ doesn't diminish or set aside his exaltation, comes into its own. The saving effectiveness of the Son's abasement is wholly dependent upon the freedom with which he gathers our abasement to himself, and upon the unhindered operation of his deity precisely in the midst of his humiliation. He empties himself. He shares the indignity of ruined creatures. But he does this without compromise to his eternal sonship. And because of that, our indignity doesn't, as it were, swallow him up. He doesn't just abandon himself to our squalor. He remains the agent of his own movement into the realm of indignity. He himself empties himself. If you want the formal language of Christian dogmatics, his passive obedience, that is, his non-resistance to the curse of death in alienation from the Father, his passive obedience is anchored in and empowered by his active obedience, his willing fulfillment of the Father's call, which is itself grounded in his eternal relation as the Son of the Father. His ministry of suffering, in other words, is that which he takes upon himself. Moreover, this work of his in which he takes our indignity upon himself, is wholly external to us in two senses. It's external first in that his work is the work of one who, precisely as the bearer of our sins, does not share our depravity. He takes sinful flesh, but he's not himself a sinner. He shares the indignity and shame of those whom he takes as his brothers and sisters, but only because he who is without sin chooses so to do. Only because he is utterly unlike us is he able to make himself like us and to occupy our place. And second, this work of his is external to us because we do not act in this matter of restoring our own dignity. We're not cooperators because we're ruined. We're beyond any repair which we ourselves might undertake. Sin distorts our agency. It sets us on false ends. It attaches us destructively to the project of self-creation and self-destruction. And so in this matter, our agency must be set aside. For dignity to be restored, we have to be humiliated. That is, the law of our creaturely nature, according to which we only have life as we receive the grace of God, that law has to be imposed upon us by God because we refuse to consent to it of ourselves. The restoration of our dignity thus depends upon Christ in our place, forcing us out of our place so that we can truly come to occupy it. And it's as this one, as the eternal Son, who's wholly unlike us, who acts in our stead and without our collaboration, it's as this one that he enters into and makes his own the situation of creatures who forfeited their own dignity and so suffer at their own hands the ignominy of broken fellowship with God. But he doesn't, however, enter the situation of estrangement and, as it were, revivify it just by assuming it to himself. That is, taken on its own, the incarnational union of word and sinful flesh is not the whole of the saving work. It's rather its ontological basis or condition. He enters our situation in order to face its actual contradiction of himself. And so, as he lives his life, he is opposed by sinners. Sinners are not passive towards him, even though he comes to effect our exaltation and rescue. No, we are actively hostile to him. And in evoking precisely this opposition, his presence exposes our indignity, and it's the occasion of the final exercise of that indignity. The sinful creatures who are encountered by him in his history, and those creatures, of course, are representatives of us all, those sinful creatures give full vent to their indignity precisely by seeking to humiliate the one who wishes to rescue them. This is the final manifestation of creaturely abasement. We abase him, and so we effect the most wicked and destructive abandonment of our vocation. They spat in his face, Matthew says. They struck him. Now, what is there in this history of the Son's degradation by degraded sinners which brings about the restoration of our dignity? Well, there is one fact, which is this, that the Son, in doing this, accomplishes the will of the Father wholly and unflinchingly. The course and effect of the Son's incarnate word can be summed up in the words of Hebrews 10, "Lo, I have come to do thy will." That is, having his being in his eternal procession from the Father, the Son of his own nature embraces the Father's will. He obeys the Father's call and fulfills that vocation precisely by offering himself to disgrace. He freely consents to be the one who is without esteem, and in just that way enacts the dignity of obedience to God on our behalf. The Lord God has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious. I turned not backward. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to those who pulled out the beard. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. And because he is that one, because he does that, then Isaiah says, I know that I shall not be put to shame. That is, he is vindicated, and he is highly exalted by the Father. Now, what's the saving effect of this filial obedience and exaltation of the Son? That which is realized in the Son's obedience to the Father is not for him alone. No, it is the fulfillment of the destiny of all creatures. In him, creaturely fellowship with God, creaturely dignity in obedience to our given form of life is brought to fruition. His obedience is the obedience of one who unites himself to the children whom God gives him. As such, It annuls our disobedience. It establishes our dignity and exalts us. Let's sum it up by listening to how Calvin gives an account of human dignity in his exposition of Psalm 8. To be crowned with glory and honour pertains, Calvin says, properly to the first beginning of the creation, when man's nature was whole and sound. But in Adam, all fell from this original nature, defacing the divine image, so that we were brought, he says, from most high excellency to sorrowful and loathsome need. And he goes on that the reversal of this situation of ruin depends upon Christ's twofold relation to the Father and his fellow creatures. They furnish an infinite supply of grace to lift us from the wreckage of sin. He says, the Heavenly Father has again bestowed the fullness of all gifts upon his Son, that all of us should draw from this wellspring. Whatsoever God bestows upon us by him, the same of right belongs in the first degree to him. Yea, he is the living image of God, according to which we must be amended, upon which all other things depend. And so, he says, his excellence and heavenly dignity are extended to us, for whose sakes he is enriched with them. Proposition 3. The attentive will have noticed that we're doing each of the Trinitarian persons, and we're at the third. God the Perfector completes the dignity of creatures by gathering them into the fellowship of the saints and empowering them actively to testify to God's protection of human dignity. The restoration of the dignity of creatures by the Son's humiliation and exaltation bestows not only status, but also enables the resumption of our vocation, because God's gift of dignity is the gift of not simply status, but moral history. That is, creaturely dignity is an ontological and moral relation to God. And so there's a perfecting work of God in relation to the creature, through which God acts to fill out human life in activity in ways which correspond to his appointment and summons. In dogmatic terms, this perfecting work of God is most properly ascribed to the Holy Spirit as the one through whom the glorified Son directs creatures to their completion. In this, the Spirit is the life giver, that is, the one who generates and sustains and purifies obedience and active consent on the part of creatures in whom he's at work. The Spirit moves creatures, and in moving them, gives them their proper spontaneity and integrity, that is, their dignity as the active children of God. So when we talk of human dignity as a form of moral life, we're not compromising the basic rule I stated at the beginning, that the dignity of creatures is a function of talk of God, along with a number of other basic moral concepts like freedom or conscience, for example. Dignity in Christian usage is a derivatively moral idea. That is, it acquires its meaning from a moral ontology, that is, an account of moral natures and ends. And that, in turn, rests upon the Gospel's recital of God's works. That's why we can't translate a Christian theology of creaturely dignity simply into language about human rights. Of course, the language of human rights is crucial, but an account of rights is only as cogent as the account of goods to which it gives expression. And an account of goods to which Christian theology is committed is irreducibly rooted in the gospel. It's not merely a set of ethical incentives. But that being said, creaturely dignity is not just a gift, it's a task. It's not simply an inequality, but it's a nature which God gives us, which brings with it a commission. God's gift of creaturely dignity gives rise to moral culture. This moral culture is a special mode of human fellowship, a gathering with others from, with, and for God, in other words, what we call the communion of saints. What distinguishes this fellowship is that it's marked out by an externality and a provisionality. The externality consists in the fact that this moral culture, this communion of saints, derives its life from God, and so it's not just a society or assembly or culture. It's a gathering around a mystery, It's not a self-perpetuating social project. Its provisionality consists in the fact that it's not just a settled form of human society, it's an anticipation of the kingdom of heaven. And because of this, the church now is not, as it were, the social terminus of the divine economy. It is simply the interim common life which awaits the consummation. How do we characterize that fellowship in which our dignity is enacted? Well, it's a fellowship which is determined by a sequence of divine acts: election, reconciliation, consummation. It's therefore not a fellowship which makes its own life up as it goes along. It's the creaturely correlate of God's will and activity. It doesn't have its power or its dynamic within itself. It's creaturely fellowship. And it's a form of fellowship directed towards common objects and united in shared access to common goods. And among those objects and goods which are at the centre of this social form of life is the divine gift of dignity. The Christian fellowship knows that God has exalted abased sinners, that God has bestowed upon sinners a worth which cannot be extinguished by any kind of humiliation, even that of sin itself. And so the church is a fellowship in which human dignity is being rediscovered. God, who is rich in mercy out of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead through our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and made us sit with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace in kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. The fellowship, therefore, is bound together by common recognition of and assent to that rich mercy by which creatures have been raised up, and by hope in the divine vindication, its life is one long reference to that movement of God. And yet, precisely because it has that reference to the movement of God's mercy, the life of the fellowship also has an inescapable horizontal dimension to it. Creaturely dignity, restored by God, locates the believers where? Well, for Ephesians, in the heavenly places. But the church also subsists in time, in the relations of persons in common life. And these relations are, if you want, the social shape which God's exalting work takes among us. These relations are characterized by acknowledgement, protection, and testimony. The dignity given to others by God presents itself to me not for my review and judgment as a possible value. No, it presents itself as something which I must recognize. In this sense, Kant was quite right. Human dignity is infinitely beyond all price. It cannot be brought into competition or comparison. What I recognized, I must also seek to protect against erosion or denial by others. I don't, of course, protect my neighbour's dignity in such a way that I make myself finally responsible for my neighbour. How can I exalt my neighbour? How can I be anything other than simply a fellow creature? How can I be God to others? But I may interpose myself between my neighbour and what eats away at his or her dignity. I may do to my neighbour what I did not do to Christ in his passion. I may defend that visibility which is basic to dignity as a social value. And in so doing, I may bear witness to the divine protection, directing both my neighbour and also perhaps the curious world to the true source of dignity. By way of really brief conclusion, here's John Chrysostom in one of his homilies on the Gospel of Matthew. Henceforth, he says, he, Jesus, leads us away from the old to the new polity, both opening to us the gates on high and sending down his Spirit from thence to call us to our country there, and not merely to call us, but also to bestow upon us the greatest mark of dignity. For he hath not made us angels and archangels, he hath caused us to become sons of God and beloved, and so he draws us on towards that portion of ours. Having then all this in thy mind, do thou show forth a life worthy of the love of him who calls thee, and of thy citizenship in that world, and of the honour that is given thee. Crucified as thou art to the world, and having crucified it to thyself, show thyself with all strictness a citizen of the city of the heavens. And do not, because thy body is translated unto heaven, do not suppose that thou hast anything to do with the earth, for thou hast thy head abiding above. Yea, with this very purpose the Lord, having first come here and having brought his angels, did then, taking thee with him, depart thither, that even before thy going up to that place, thou mightest understand that it is possible for thee to inhabit earth as it were heaven. Let us then keep watch over that noble birth which we receive from the beginning, and let us every day seek more and more the palaces there, and account all that is here to be but a shadow and a dream. What's Chrysostom doing? Well, he's summarising the dogmatics and ascetics of creaturely dignity and their grounds in the saving economy of Christ and the Spirit. What he says, of course, strikes us immediately as rather disappointing. At first glance, there's rather little in that homily on dignity as a moral and political reality. We have our heads in heaven. But look a bit further. There is the language of polity, of country, of citizenship, of palaces. In other words, there's the language of life in common which stems from our exaltation to be the children of God, with, he says, the greatest mark of dignity. Might it not be that the life of the communion of saints now is a place where it's given to creatures to keep watch over that noble birth which God has given to us by his work of regeneration? And might it not be that in keeping watch over that, in living from and for the city of heavens, in inhabiting earth as it were heaven, that the saints assist in protecting the dignity in which the destiny of creatures consists? Thanks.
Well, can I thank you, Dr. Webster, for a very intriguing, fulfilling and enriching experience in your lecture about the completion of, by God, of our dignity. As is the usual custom, I'd like to invite questions for the audience. Now I've got a number of hands that are going straight up. If you'd just like to wait a second, the microphone will come around to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is really on the practical outworkings of the concept of the dignity of the human being being grounded in that relationship with God, and how it ties in with human rights language, which you did mention for just a moment, because the human rights language is so popular in Canada. In fact, it was a New Brunswick lawyer, I believe, who helped popularize it, and one of the leaders of our national parties written on it extensively. Is there any dialogue between the two, or is human rights language so grounded in the natural view of man that you can't discuss between them, in which case what's the point of contact in our discussions on ethics and on what should be done? And if there is contact between them, is it simply a difference in motivation, and the outworking of whatever you come out with when you emphasize the dignity of the human creature, human rights is the same?
Thank you. That's a very kind of intriguing, important question, I think. I think an account of human rights it's an interim account. It's got to rest on a prior account of human goods, because rights are there to protect our access to certain goods. And therefore, if rights language is going to actually do any real work politically and socially, it's got to be about essentially some kind of view of what constitutes the human good and the things to which we ought to have access and which ought to be protected by a pattern of human rights. Now, I think in most developed Western societies, the language of rights has got detached from a theory of goods. Or another explanation of the same state of affairs is to say the language of rights has simply become a way of promoting one particular version of what constitutes human goods. And the good that most contemporary accounts of human rights tends to promote is essentially the good of spontaneous self-fulfillment. Now, I mean, I don't think there's any way that the Christian gospel cannot have a quarrel with that. Not because it doesn't want people to be fulfilled and happy, but because it thinks that spontaneous self-fulfillment is not the way in which creatures are happy. So, in its public theology, on this point, I think, the Christian gospel is going to have a pretty serious quarrel with its neighbours. Now, the crucial thing for me then, is how does that quarrel happen? It can happen in condemnatory mode, and it often does. Perhaps the point at which that most often happens is issues about the termination of pregnancy or end-of-life issues. And those can become intractably bitter disputes, which often simply become pure conflict without actually any reference to the issues involved. It's not really a way of talking about what constitutes the human good. It's simply two groups who hate one another. So it can't happen like that. What we therefore need, I think, to try to discover is a mode in which the church can engage in public discourse, can register its disagreement with accepted ideas of the human good, but can do so in a way which commends the Christian good rather than simply condemns the good that others are proposing. I think that's intractably difficult, and I think it's a job at which we're very bad at doing it. We're unlikely to be able to do it well under any human circumstances, and it's a job we've got to do. And part of the discipline of the church, I think, is learning how to do that and learning, in a way, the kind of public humiliation which comes from at some level, failing to do that, and yet stumblingly trying to indicate the good that it seeks to commend. But unless it does commend that good, unless it has that disagreement with its neighbours, then it's not quite loving the world, because it needs to love the world by saying what its confession says is the truth, and commending it as gently and lovingly and yet as unashamedly as it can. I mean, does that get to the point? In practical terms, that probably means, therefore, the church is going to have some distance, at least, from certain kinds of public policy. It will sometimes be a camp follower. There will be points at which you will be able to rejoice, but there'll often be points at which it's got to say, we can't go with you on that. There isn't, I think, a single kind of pattern or policy that can be put into place. What there are sets of convictions which have to be kind of non-negotiable. Otherwise, in the end, the church will no longer be speaking the gospel and therefore won't be able to contribute to the world's healing.
Thank you. Second question? Yes, sir, at the back. Microphone's just coming up to you.
My problem is that, in agreement with what you're saying here, with sin as abasement, hasn't human rights become an abased idea, where the idea that we're protection of our own personal self-fulfillment is more than the protection of the dignity of others? And isn't the reflection of dignity the protection of others? So, I mean, there's really no conflict in human rights if we could have the proper concept of human rights, but man tends to take and say, well, me first, you last, instead of the golden rule.
Yeah, I mean, that's precisely what's happened to the language of rights when it gets detached from an account of the human good. I mean, right becomes my unfettered access to the goods that I believe are absolutely proper to me. And inevitably, that simply generates conflict, because it makes human society into what Hobbes said it was, the war of everybody against everybody else. And so therefore, you trying to develop mechanisms to adjudicate that battle, either by deciding some people's goods are more important than other people's goods, in which case you just have constrained conflict, or you basically think in terms of which group shouts loudest gets most. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that that's just the world, because the church operates like that in a great deal of its decision making. You go to any church meeting about budget and you get pretty much the same thing. In other words, it's an expression of something which is endemic to the condition of fallen creatures, that we seek to protect our own bodies.
So less the social contract, equality, and more,
Yeah.
we are just a part of the world,
Yeah.
but with a sort of a knighted or dignified
Yeah.
viewpoint because God loves us.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But it doesn't take too much reflection on the history of Western political society to show that the social contract don't work very well, does it? That doesn't afford the kind of protection that it's supposed to protect. It simply becomes usually an arena for conflict rather than a way of ending conflict. So in other words, Christians are going to have to say, look, if we're going to have an account of human dignity, we've got to have a stronger theory of goods than the one which is being operated by in public. We've got to have an account of goods, therefore, which is not tied simply to the will, but is tied to being. What really is the case about human creatures? Because if it's simply tied to the will, what good do I want for myself and can I manage to grasp from other people, then it will simply be wholly conflictual. That's why what we need is not just moral policy or legal frameworks for discussion. What we need is an account of what it means to be a human being. And without that, the language of human rights is not going to be able to do all that much.
So more of an external accountability and obedience.
Yes, and obedience to something which is really the case in the world. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there somebody else who'd like to ask a question?
There's a question, a gentleman here.
Yes, sir. Right, let's just get the microphone around you. Just bear with us 2 seconds. Go on, Paul.
I want to focus in a bit on the commending of goods. It seems to me we have, in my experience, too many instances of two very different situations emerge. You engaged in a discussion with someone or a group of people about what directions we should be going, and what one side proposes to be a good thing, the other side demonizes as a bad thing, and then there isn't really any commending of goods going on. It's simply your goods are actually bad and my goods are goods, and away we go.
Yeah.
But another situation is where people get beyond that, and they do get to the point where they can acknowledge that at least much of what the other person is trying to do is a good thing, okay? So that both sides are willing to acknowledge that much of what the other side is attempting to achieve is good.
Yep.
But then they discover that they prioritize those goods differently. And in my experience, that's the more difficult of the two situations, because trying to explain to someone else why you happen to consider one good to have priority over another, and to try to understand why the other person thinks that way seems to be extraordinarily difficult for us.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very helpful comment. I do think that is often the case as a kind of, if you want, a kind of intermediate level of conflict about the human good. One area in which I think exactly that pattern happens is over allocation of resources, which is obviously a major issue in any human society, particularly in kind of North Atlantic society at the moment. How much of the social pot goes to which project, and people, as you say, have different prioritizing of certain goods. So this goes to healthcare, that goes to education, or whatever. And there are those cases, and you're dead right that it is very difficult within that situation to get people simply to listen carefully enough to one another to see how they are arranging those goods. But I think in a way, there's also a more fundamental kind of conflict. Most modern societies think the extension of life by healthcare is simply a natural good. I don't think the church thinks that. I don't think the church thinks that the extension of life is in and of itself particularly important. And that's because the church thinks your soul is more important than your body. And it's at that level that the conflict is more sharp. But you're dead right that even if you solve that one, you've then got issues about kind of, as it were, intermediate goods to figure out. And a wise policymaker is going to be involved in that. And some of the most intractable problems that Christians in public life are going to face are exactly what you said. How do you enable people to just listen carefully enough to one another that you can try to keep the peace on those kinds of issues, or try to solve how we should act and spend?
I think we have time just for one more question.
I enjoyed the way that you spoke about humans as being creatures, and I was enjoying that through the first part, instead of saying humankind or it's just creatures. And then I ran into trouble in the later part when you spoke about humans as being, about creatures being sinners and needing reconciliation and so on, which got my mind running to, okay, well, how does creatureliness and all that you're saying about it, how does that fit with non-human creatures? And then I got into thinking about Romans chapter 8 of all of creation groaning and travailing and longing for the freedom that they'll have. And can you comment briefly on fallen creation apart from humanity and how it relates to humanity's reconciliation?
Yeah. I mean, it's clear, isn't it, that the New Testament, actually the canon, thinks that the sin of Adam's race has knock-on effects beyond the human creature. It doesn't poison the relation of angelic being to God, but to some extent it muddies the relation of the bestial and material orders of being to God. How God deals with that, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. How God deals with it, we don't know. What we do know is that those spheres of reality are, of course, themselves governed by God, and that Jesus Christ rules over them, and that they will therefore be caught up within his saving purposes, and there'll be not just a lot of Christians in heaven, all sorts of other people as well, but there will be a new heaven and a new earth. In other words, that creation itself is within the scope of God's creation. However, Scripture tells us the history of Adam, and not much else besides. And in a way, one simply has to say, these are curious things, but Scripture sets the limits of what we may inquire into. Sorry, that's not a terribly kind of speculative response. I think it's simply the limits that we operate within.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon Dr. Evans to sum the evening up and to offer our thanks. He is the director of the Hayward Lecture Series.
Thank you, Professor Webster, for very stimulating lectures these past 3 evenings. I know we've all enjoyed them very much, and we've learned much. I want to remind you that there is a book table still out there. A few titles are left. This will be your opportunity to pick up a volume and also get the author's autograph. You don't want to pass up on that opportunity. I also, as is our custom at the end of the Wednesday lecture, is to announce the speaker for next year. Professor Edith Humphrey from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary will be our 2010 Hayward Lecture. So that is something to look forward to. There isn't a title of the lecture series yet. And as you prepare to leave this evening and chit-chat and so on and look at the books, please take a few moments to fill out the evaluation form. This is very helpful for us as we think about and plan for future Hayward lectures. So with that, I wish you good night, and let's end the evening with a round of applause for our speaker.